In 2013, professional climbers Uli Steck, Simono Moro, and photographer Jonathan Griffith were attempting to climb and document a challenging summit of Mount Everest up the western ridge without oxygen, without a fixed rope, and without the support of Sherpas. Now, as many of you know, when you're climbing at that altitude, you have to acclimate to it. So one day they trekked on over to the Lhotse face. This is the southeast end of the summit of Everest, where a lot of the guided expeditions go for people who pay the money to try to summit Everest. The only thing is on that day, all the expeditions and the guides knew to stay off the Lhotse face because the Sherpas were fixing ropes for future climbers to come up. These three alpinists, Uli, Jonathan, and Simono, they didn't know anything about that policy. So they just started up the Lhotse face, staying out of the way of the Sherpas. But at one point, they had to traverse across the ropes. Uli was the first to do so, and when he came over there, the lead Sherpa, who is fixing lines, yells down at them to get down, and he begins to rappel down the face. As he's coming down, Uli puts his hands up in order to keep from falling, but his hands hit the Sherpa, and the Sherpa took it as an act of aggression. Later, some Sherpas below said that Uli kicked some ice up, and it hit them as well. Meanwhile, Uli's climbing partner, Simono, he's over to the side. He sees what's happening with the ice pick and the yelling, and he yells out at this Sherpa, and he calls him a blah, 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 both in English and Nepali. The radio was on, and so everybody at base camp heard what he said. Well, in order to defuse the situation, one of the lead expedition guides named Greg, he brings the Sherpas down, and they all come down in order to talk about what happened up there. But these Sherpas were angry, and they come over to Uli and Simono and Jonathan with rocks in their hands. Uli gets hit in the head with one of them, begins to bleed. Simono was kicked and slapped, and supposedly Uli said they were wanting to get him out of the tent, and they were talking about killing him. Well, luckily everyone lived to tell about the story, but it became world famous. It was the brawl on Everest. In fact, Red Bull did a documentary of what happened there in 2013, and they called it High Tension. High tension, meaning the tensions were high, but they were also really high up at 22,000 feet. Now you can imagine all the pressure that there is. I mean, there's lots of people who are paying a whole lot of money, taking time off of work, trying to summit Everest. You've got alpinists, these professionals who are trying to do something that is so challenging, but you also got Sherpas up there who are risking their lives. There's a whole lot of pressure. And come to find out, there were also a lot of underlying tensions that had gone on for years between Sherpas and Westerners. You see, the Sherpas felt left out and dismissed in a lot of the hype and documentation of Mount Everest throughout time. They had become more educated, making more money, trying to build better lives for them, and they just didn't feel like there was a lot of equity in the way that Everest was talked about. So again, everybody lived to tell about it, but you all, this just goes to show the level of confrontation and conflict that can happen at 22,000 feet when a few people are not on the same page with everyone else. You know, I don't think we have to go to 22,000 feet to know this level of confrontation, because we know it at 676 feet. That's how much Chattanooga is above sea level, right? I mean, I would bet that within the last month, you have been confronted or you have had to confront someone else. Maybe a coworker, maybe a family member, extended family member, maybe somebody in the checkout line or in traffic or on social media. But confrontation, it's almost inescapable. And in the church, we are called to be, what we're saying here in this series, a tethered community. We've got to be bound together. And so today, we're going to be looking at a passage of Scripture. We're not just talking about all confrontation, although I think some of the things we're talking about would be helpful for all confrontation, but specifically confrontation in the church. Jesus has as we're recapped last week, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16 that he was going to build his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And in Matthew 18, he's laying the foundation work of our relationships in the church. And those relationships are supposed to be tight and bound together. If you got your Bible, we're in Matthew chapter 18. We're in part 2 of this series. This is the fourth of 5 discourses in the Gospel of Matthew, teaching discourses. And again, this one's all about church relationships. Let's see what Jesus has to say about confrontation, starting with verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and as a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I among them. Now, there's a lot packed into those 6 short verses. One of the things about Matthew 18 that gets talked about often is the orderly process of confrontation. It follows some very sequential steps here. And the idea is that holding on to one another, we have to confront as personally and privately as possible with each successive step in the attempt of gaining a hearer, in an effort to keep the family of God bound together. For example, it starts with a one-on-one confrontation, and if you gain a hearer, that's great. Then the bond stays tight. If that doesn't work, you should get 2 or 3 other witnesses and do the confrontation. If that doesn't work, step 3, you should tell it to the church. And you see, at each point, it's personal and it's private to those relationships that are most affected immediately by the situation. Now, it doesn't take much to know this is not the way our society handles confrontation. I mean, our society, we're rewarded for very public confrontation that's impersonal as well, with the title of going viral or getting more followers, which could even lead to getting more money on your channel or something. But the way of the church is different. Now, I think the process you can read, and you've probably heard this orderly process before. That's not exactly what I want to focus on today when it comes to these verses. I want to talk about something else. I want to talk about this idea of holding on to one another requires strength to confront and to be confronted. I just want to break that down for just a second. First, holding on to one another requires strength to confront. One of the powerful things about what Jesus does here is that Jesus empowers victims. People that have sinned against, Jesus says, you need to stand up. I like what one of the study resources I use, the way it says it. It says, one cannot always avoid being a victim, but one can avoid the victim mentality. I mean, think about all that we've heard in, say, the last 5, 10, 15 years, especially with sex abuse scandals or racism or all sorts of other things. Isn't it encouraging to know that Jesus is empowering victims to go and tell, to deal with what has happened, to stand strong and stand up? Confronting is one of the hardest things to do. But let me also say that confronting is also one of the most caring, loving things that you can do. Not just for that person, but in some of those extreme cases, for the sake of loving other people as well. You see, when you confront somebody, you're saying you are worth loving. You are worth the effort. You are worth me overcoming my anxiousness and my fear, because I want to see healing happen in this relationship, or I want to see justice happen in this world. Let me also say that if you have found somebody that's willing to confront you about your sin, and they've done it like Matthew 18, doing it with genuineness, humility, and care for you, you have found a comrade on this uphill Everest climb of life, and you should hold on to them. Which really leads to the second part of what I want to say there is holding on to one another requires strength to confront, but also strength to be confronted. It's hard to receive somebody telling us that we have done them wrong. It's so easy to become defensive and to lash back out. I mean, when somebody's confronting us, we want to be like, well, what about your sin? Of course, that circles back to what we talked about last week and the importance of self-confrontation. We can't be, calling other people out with the speck in their eye if we've got a plank in our own eye. I mean, Jesus said that in one of the other teaching discourses in Matthew. But it also takes a lot of strength to receive another person. But let me also say this. We're not just simply, when we're talking about strength, we're not just simply talking about personal strength. We're talking about confronting and being confronted with the strength of Christ. A lot of people have talked about verse 20 before, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I among them. We've often heard that used in terms of, like Jesus' presence is with our small group, or if we're just meeting with 2 or 3 people in our house, we're a church. And not to take away from the fact that Jesus' presence is among us in those situations, that's not the context that we're talking about here in Matthew chapter 18. What Jesus is saying is, when 2 or 3 people are going to confront another person about their sin, I'm backing them. My presence is with them, and in the church I've given them the power to bind and loose. That is to make these decisions, to tie these things together, that he's right there, his presence is among them. Wow, that changes it a little bit, doesn't it? To say that when I confront, I have the confidence that when I've done it according to Matthew 18, that Jesus is with me in this, or those of us he's with us in this. Likewise, if we're being confronted by 2 or 3 others, we should receive those people as if we're receiving Jesus, as if Jesus was physically right there confronting us about our sin. Remember that Jesus is the incarnation of God's love. And so confrontation is a courageous act of love, and we should see it as such. The reason for confrontation, according to Matthew 18, is again to tie us closer together. That's the purpose. That we gain a hearer. We know this love extends so much so that, verse 17, it says, if this whole process falls apart, this is what you should do. You should treat them like a Gentile and a tax collector. Now that's a bit of a controversial verse, because on the one hand, it sounds like the xenophobia, like Jew and Gentile, just treat them like a Gentile, treat them less than, dismiss them, or whatnot. But then we ask, well, how did Jesus treat Gentiles and tax collectors? After all, one of his disciples was a tax collector, and we know that Jesus went out of his way to reach out to Gentiles. Perhaps it means this. Perhaps it means that even when somebody doesn't heed the confrontation about their sin, that we remain open to the relationship, that we keep them not at an arm's distance in a bad way, but we keep our arms reaching out to them, available and open to them, again, in love. I wish that confrontation worked like Matthew 18. I wish it was that loving. I wish we were that strong that we felt like we could handle that, because so often this is not the way that confrontation happens. A lot of times people just move on to another church or try to find a different family of God to hang out with, be with. I wish it worked like this. And this passage obviously assumes that you're dealing with a pure, genuine, loving, humble church, that they're going through this process. We could ask, what happens when Matthew 18 falls apart, when there's abuse of power or people aren't confronting in the right way? Well, let me say this. We don't have to look very far. This is exactly what happened to Jesus. You remember that Jesus was confronted with the sin that he never committed. Jesus was tried at night, and multiple witnesses confronted him to push a preconceived trial ahead. Jesus was crucified by sin. He was confronted and crucified by sin, and yet he was crucified for sin. He was crucified by sin, for sin. I mean, even the sin of those who confronted him wrongly. Think about this. Receiving righteous confrontation is receiving someone's love. Receiving unrighteous confrontation is a way of us loving others. Either way, confrontation is a means towards wholeness. It is an act of courageous love. One more interesting factoid about the brawl that happened there on Everest in 2013. Simono Moro, the one who called that Sherpa a blah, 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 well, he has a helicopter and does rescue missions on Everest. As the story goes, a few days after the incident, he flew his helicopter in to recover a body of one of the Sherpas who died. And that day, some other Sherpas that were helping load the body onto the helicopter were some of the same Sherpas that were confronting him just a few days prior. It's a powerful example out there in the world at 22,000 feet of what can happen when confrontation is done and people do it in love and people move forward together, even in the hardest of situations. I want to encourage you this week and even right now to think about those people that perhaps need your courageous act of confrontation, or perhaps those who have tried confronting you and maybe you haven't been so receptive to them, that maybe you could trust that they really do love you. They care about you. They want your wholeness and healing, and they love you, and they're here for you. I also encourage you to spend some time. We're posting a few questions here in the video today to pour over these verses in Matthew 18, 15 through 20, but also to work yourself through some of those questions and to take action, because confrontation is a means towards wholeness. Confrontation is a courageous act of love. May you have a great week this week. May you wrestle with these things, confront and be confronted with the strength of Jesus.